The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town of Willowbrook. The streets were quiet, filled with the soft sound of birds singing in the trees. An old man, Elijah Carter, walked slowly down the sidewalk with the help of a wooden cane. Each step was careful, his body leaning on the cane as if it were his most trusted friend. Elijah was in his 70s, his hair silver and his back slightly bent from age. He wore a simple brown coat and an old hat that shaded his eyes. The cane he carried was not just any cane. It had belonged to his father, who had marched many years ago in the struggle for equal rights. Every time Elijah held it, he felt the strength of his father's spirit guiding him. This morning, Elijah was heading to the small grocery store to buy some bread and milk. He enjoyed walking in the morning air, even if his body often grew tired. People in town knew him as a gentle man who always smiled and greeted others politely. But not everyone saw him that way. At the same time, Officer Daniel Blake was on his morning patrol. Daniel was young, only in his late 20s, with sharp eyes and a serious face. He had only been working in Willowbrook for 2 years, but he wanted to prove himself. He often thought that being tough was the only way to keep the town safe. As Daniel drove slowly down the street, he noticed Elijah walking with his cane. For reasons even Daniel himself did not fully understand, suspicion crept into his mind. The cane caught his attention. To him, it looked unusual, thick, heavy, almost like something more than just a walking stick. His training had taught him to watch for anything out of place, and today his eyes turned Elijah into a question mark. He parked the car and stepped out, walking toward Elijah with a firm voice. "Good morning, sir. Can I ask where you're going?" Daniel said. Elijah stopped, leaning on his cane, and looked at the officer kindly. "Just heading to the store, young man. The morning air is good for these old bones." Daniel frowned. His eyes stayed fixed on the cane. "That's quite a stick you've got there. Mind if I take a closer look?" Elijah's smile faded a little. The cane was personal, a piece of his family's history. He didn't like the idea of handing it over, but he didn't want trouble either. "It's just my walking cane," he said softly. "It helps me move around. Been with me a long time." But Daniel's tone grew firmer. "I need to make sure. Sir, please hand it over." A few people on the street began to notice the scene. A woman across the road paused with her grocery bag. 2 teenagers on bicycles slowed down to watch. Elijah felt his chest tighten. He was simply walking to the store, and yet now he was being treated as if he were doing something wrong. With a deep breath, Elijah shook his head gently. "Young man, this cane has been with my family for years. It's no danger to anyone. I ask you kindly to trust me." Daniel crossed his arms, his face unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried suspicion. "I'm just doing my job. You need to understand that." Elijah felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He had lived long enough to see many changes in the world. Some good, some painful. He had taught himself patience, but moments like this reminded him that not everyone saw him for who he truly was. To Daniel, he was not Elijah Carter, the kind neighbor, the church volunteer, the grandfather who told stories to children. He was only a man with a cane that looked different. The silence between them grew heavy. Finally, Elijah adjusted his hat and took a step back. "Young man," he said quietly, "sometimes the eyes can see only what they fear, not the truth in front of them." Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. His hand hovered near his belt, as if his body still wanted to act tough, but his heart felt a small tug of doubt. Was he really looking at danger, or just an old man trying to live his day? Before the moment could stretch further, Elijah nodded politely and continued walking toward the store. His cane tapped gently against the sidewalk, steady and strong. Daniel stood still, watching him go, his mind strangely unsettled. The people, who had been watching, whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads at the officer, others gave sympathetic looks to Elijah. But Elijah kept walking, shoulders straight, refusing to let humiliation bend him further. When he finally reached the grocery store, the shopkeeper greeted him warmly. "Morning, Mr. Carter. You're up early today?" Elijah forced a small smile. "Morning, son. Yes, just needed some bread and milk." Inside, as he picked up his groceries, his thoughts returned again and again to the young officer. He wondered what had made Daniel look at him with suspicion. Was it the cane? Was it his age? Was it something deeper? Elijah sighed, shaking his head. He did not want to carry bitterness in his heart. Life had already shown him enough hardship, and he believed in kindness more than anger. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to his patrol car, but he could not shake the image of the old man's eyes, calm, sad, but strong. Something about that moment made him uneasy. He had followed his training. Yes, but had he followed his heart? As the sun rose higher, both men went on with their day. Neither knew it yet, but this small encounter would be the beginning of a story that would touch not just their lives, but the entire town of Willowbrook. For now, though, it was simply a morning. An old man with a cane and a young officer who could not see the whole truth. The next day in Willowbrook began much like any other. The small town buzzed with its usual rhythm, children rushing to school, shopkeepers opening their doors, and neighbors greeting each other with warm smiles. Yet beneath the calm surface, quiet whispers moved from street to street. It didn't take long for the story of Elijah Carter and Officer Daniel Blake to spread. People talked in the bakery, in the barber shop, and even in the little park near the river. Some said the officer had been only doing his job, while others said Elijah had been treated unfairly. The town was split, and the misunderstanding began to grow. Elijah himself tried not to think about it too much. After all, he was used to life bringing difficult moments. Instead, he spent his morning watering the flowers in front of his small brick house. His neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, came over with a worried look on her face. "Elijah," she said softly, "I heard what happened yesterday. That officer stopped you on Main Street. Why would he do such a thing?" Elijah gave a gentle smile. "It was nothing, Margaret. He was just doing what he thought was right. Sometimes people see things differently than they really are." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "But you've lived here longer than most of us. Everyone knows you. He should have known better." Elijah didn't reply. He just kept tending to his flowers, humming an old tune. In his heart, he felt a touch of sadness, but he refused to let bitterness take root. On the other side of town, Officer Daniel was having a very different morning. As he entered the station, two fellow officers gave him curious looks. One of them, Officer Reed, raised his eyebrows. "Hey, Blake," Reed said, "I heard you stopped old Mr. Carter yesterday. What was that about?" "The man's nearly 80. Daniel stiffened. "He had a cane that looked suspicious. I was just being careful." Reed chuckled. "Suspicious? That cane is older than you. Half the town knows it belonged to his father. You might have upset the wrong man." Daniel frowned but said nothing. Inside, his chest tightened. He remembered Elijah's calm eyes, the words that had quietly cut through his pride. Sometimes the eyes can see only what they fear. The pride memory stayed with him, even when he tried to push it away. By afternoon, the story had reached the town square. A group of people gathered near the fountain, talking loudly. Some defended Daniel, saying officers had to be strict to keep the town safe. Others argued Elijah deserved respect, not suspicion. Among them was Sarah, a young teacher who often visited Elijah to hear his stories. "Mr. Carter is one of the kindest souls in Willowbrook," she said firmly. "If he carries a cane, it is because he needs it. Nothing more. We should honor him, not question him." An older man nearby shook his head. "Officers have a hard job. Maybe Blake saw something we didn't. Better safe than sorry." The voices clashed, neither side willing to let go. What had been a small encounter was now becoming a topic for the whole town. That evening, Elijah sat on his porch, the cane resting against his chair. He looked out at the street as the lamps flickered on. Children laughed in the distance, chasing fireflies, their voices full of innocence. Elijah smiled faintly, wishing adults could see the world with the same open heart as children. A knock came at his gate. It was young Sarah. She stepped in with a gentle smile and carried a basket of apples. "I brought these for you, Mr. Carter," she said. "They're from my mother's garden." Elijah thanked her warmly and invited her to sit. As they shared slices of apple, Sarah asked softly, "Does it bother you what people are saying?" Elijah thought for a long moment before answering. "Child, words come and go like the wind. What matters is what stays in the heart. If my heart grows bitter, then I've lost more than any man can take from me." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes shining with admiration. She often felt Elijah's words carried more wisdom than any book. Meanwhile, Daniel walked through the same streets, his patrol car parked a few blocks away. He noticed how people glanced at him, some with respect, others with quiet judgment. He felt caught between two worlds. To some, he was the strong officer protecting the town. To others, he was the man who had disrespected Elijah Carter. That night, Daniel returned home restless. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. His younger sister, Lily, noticed his silence. "What's wrong, Daniel?" she asked. He rubbed his forehead. "I think I might have made a mistake. I stopped an old man yesterday, and now the whole town is talking about it." Lily tilted her head. "Was it Mr. Carter?" Daniel looked up in surprise. "You know him?" "Of course," she said softly. "He told stories at the library when I was little. He always made me feel safe. If you upset him, then maybe you should think about why." Her words stayed with Daniel long after she left the room. For the first time in a long while, he began to wonder if his way of judging people so quickly was wrong. Back on his porch, Elijah lifted his cane and rested it across his lap. He thought about his father, about the long march for dignity so many years ago. That cane was more than wood. It was memory, history, and love carved into one simple object. He whispered to himself, "This cane has carried me through life. And maybe, just maybe, it will carry someone else to understanding too." The night grew quiet. The misunderstanding had not yet been cleared, but seeds of change were slowly being planted. One in Elijah's patient heart, and one in Daniel's restless conscience. And so, the town of Willowbrook prepared for the days to come, not knowing that this simple cane would soon become the center of a story that touched every soul. The week passed quietly in Willowbrook, but beneath the surface, feelings remained unsettled. Some townsfolk continued to whisper about the morning on Main Street when Officer Daniel Blake stopped Elijah Carter. For Elijah, the days were filled with his usual routines, watering his flowers, feeding the birds, and walking to the little park for fresh air. Yet something inside him had begun to weigh heavy. Elijah's health had never been strong in his later years. His heart often grew tired, and his legs sometimes trembled after long walks. Still, he refused to sit inside all day. "If I stop moving, I'll stop living," he often told himself with a small smile. His cane tapped faithfully on the ground with every step, steady and strong, though his body was not. One warm afternoon, Elijah decided to visit the park. The air smelled of fresh grass, and children's laughter floated through the trees. Families picnicked on blankets, and old friends played chess under the shade. Elijah walked slowly to his favorite bench near the fountain, leaning heavily on his cane. But as he reached the bench, a sudden wave of dizziness swept over him. His vision blurred, and his knees buckled. Elijah tried to steady himself with the cane, but his body trembled. His chest ached, and before he could call out, he sank weakly onto the ground beside the fountain. Gasps echoed from nearby. A woman shouted, "Someone help him!" Children stopped playing, their eyes wide with worry, and by fate, or perhaps something greater, Officer Daniel Blake was on patrol near the park at that very moment. He heard the commotion and rushed toward the fountain, his boots pounding against the pavement. When he reached the scene, his eyes widened in surprise. It was Elijah. The old man lay against the stone fountain, his cane beside him, his breathing shallow. Daniel froze for a moment, memories of their first encounter flooding back, the suspicion, the doubt, the calm yet wounded look in Elijah's eyes. Now the same man was not standing tall with dignity, but struggling simply to breathe. Daniel dropped to his knees. "Mr. Carter, stay with me," he said urgently. His training kicked in, but something else stirred in his chest. Guilt. He felt it deep and sharp, like a shadow over his heart. Elijah opened his eyes weakly. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Young man, it's just my heart. It gets tired sometimes." Daniel pressed his hand gently against Elijah's shoulder. "I'll get help. Don't move." He called for an ambulance on his radio, his voice tight with worry. As they waited, Daniel held Elijah's cane in his hands. For the first time, he truly looked at it. The wood was smooth from years of use, carved with small marks and symbols. It was not strange, not suspicious. It was beautiful, a story written in wood. Why didn't I see this before? Daniel thought. His chest ached, not from running, but from regret. Elijah watched him silently, his tired eyes soft but steady. Even in weakness, there was no anger in them. Instead, there was something else. Understanding. Soon the ambulance arrived. Paramedics lifted Elijah gently and placed him on a stretcher. Daniel stood nearby, feeling both helpless and responsible. As the stretcher was carried into the vehicle, Elijah reached out a shaky hand. His cane rested beside him, and he motioned for Daniel to come closer. "Officer Blake," Elijah whispered, his voice faint but clear. "Do not judge a man by what he carries in his hand. Judge him by what he carries in his heart." The words struck Daniel like a bell ringing in silence. He swallowed hard, nodding, though he could not find the right words to reply. The ambulance doors closed and the siren wailed as it sped toward the hospital. Daniel remained in the park, his hands trembling slightly. Around him, townsfolk who had witnessed the scene whispered again. But this time, their whispers carried concern for Elijah and quiet questions about the young officer who had rushed to his side. That evening, Daniel visited the hospital. He stood nervously in the hallway, unsure if he would be welcome. Through the window of the small room, he saw Elijah resting peacefully, the cane leaning against the chair beside his bed. Sarah, the young teacher, sat at his side reading softly from a book. Daniel almost turned away, but Elijah opened his eyes and noticed him. A faint smile touched the old man's lips. He lifted a hand slightly, inviting Daniel to enter. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and quiet hope. Elijah's voice was weak, but steady enough. "I see you came, young man." Daniel cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. I had to make sure you were all right." Sarah looked at Daniel carefully, but Elijah gave her a nod, and she stepped outside to give them space. Daniel sat down on the chair beside the bed, his hands restless. "Mr. Carter, I think I owe you more than just checking in. I judged you wrongly that day. I looked at your cane and saw only suspicion, not the man holding it. And now, seeing you like this, I realize how wrong I was." Elijah studied him with kind eyes, though tired. We all stumble, Officer Blake. What matters is, if we rise differently than we fell. The words sank deep into Daniel's heart. He bowed his head. I want to rise differently. I don't want to be the man who looks at people and sees only fear. Elijah's lips curved into a gentle smile. Then perhaps this cane has already begun its work, not just for me, but for you. For the first time since he joined the force, Daniel felt his heart soften in a way his training never taught him. He sat quietly, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, realizing that this moment, this breaking point, was not just Elijah's struggle with health. It was his own turning point, a chance to choose a better path. As night fell over Willowbrook, the town outside remained unaware of the quiet conversation in the hospital room. But inside, something had shifted. Something that would change the lives of both men and soon the entire community. The hospital room was quiet the next morning, filled only with the soft rhythm of Elijah Carter's breathing and the gentle hum of machines. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden lines across the floor. The cane rested in its usual place, leaning against the chair, standing like a silent guardian. Daniel Blake sat beside Elijah's bed, feeling strangely restless. He had visited again before starting his shift. Something about the old man drew him back, as though there was an unfinished lesson waiting for him. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he wanted to listen. Elijah stirred, opening his eyes. His face was pale but peaceful. He noticed Daniel sitting there, hands folded awkwardly in his lap. "You again," Elijah said with a small chuckle. His voice was weak but warm. "You must be tired of hospital walls already." Daniel shook his head. "No, sir. I wanted to see how you were doing." Elijah studied him carefully, his eyes kind but sharp, like someone who could see deeper than most. "And what else? You're not here just for that." Daniel hesitated. He glanced at the cane, then back at Elijah. "That cane. I can't stop thinking about it. You told me not to judge a man by what he carries in his hand. I realized I never asked you where it came from. I'd like to know if you're willing to tell me." A silence followed. Elijah's eyes softened, and he slowly reached for the cane. His thin fingers brushed over its smooth surface, tracing the carved patterns worn down by time. "This cane," Elijah began, his voice low but steady, "was not bought in a shop. It was carved by my father with his own hands, many years ago. Back then, the world was harder for men like him. He walked miles to work, miles to church, and miles to marches where people stood up for what was right." Daniel leaned forward, listening closely. Elijah continued, his eyes distant, as though seeing the past before him. "My father carried this cane not because he needed it, but because it gave him strength. Each mark you see here is a memory. This small cut near the bottom, that came from the rocky road he walked on the day he joined others in a march for freedom. This notch near the top, that came when he shielded me as a child from stumbling in the rain. Every scratch, every groove, it tells a story of survival and dignity." Daniel reached out carefully, and Elijah nodded, allowing him to hold it. The young officer turned the cane gently in his hands, noticing the details for the first time. Tiny carvings of circles and lines decorated the wood, faded with age but still beautiful. "I thought it looked strange," Daniel admitted quietly. "I thought it meant danger. But now, it feels more like history, like it belongs in a museum, not in suspicion." Elijah smiled faintly. "It belongs where it has always belonged, in the hands of someone who remembers what it stands for. My father gave it to me when he grew old. He said, 'Elijah, this cane is not just to carry your weight. It is to remind you of where you come from and who you are.' I've carried it ever since." Daniel sat in silence, his heart heavy with regret. He realized how blind he had been. All this time he had seen only a stick. Yet it was a story, a family legacy, a symbol of hope. "Why didn't you tell me that day?" Daniel asked softly. Elijah chuckled again. "Would you have listened? You were too busy seeing what you feared. Sometimes a lesson must come slowly, like rain sinking into dry ground." Daniel lowered his head, ashamed but grateful. "I'm listening now." For a long moment, the room was quiet. Then Elijah's expression softened further. "You know, Officer Blake, we all carry something. Some carry fear, some carry pride, some carry memories. What matters most is what we choose to pass on to others. My father gave me strength through this cane. Perhaps I can give you something too." Daniel looked up, surprised. "Me? What could I deserve from you after the way I treated you?" "Understanding," Elijah said simply. "And maybe forgiveness, if you're ready for it." The young officer's eyes stung. He had expected anger, but instead he found grace. It was not what he thought he deserved, but it was what he needed most. At that moment, Sarah entered the room carrying a tray of food. She smiled politely at Daniel, but paused when she saw the cane in his hands. "So," she said lightly, "you finally heard the story?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, and it's more than I ever imagined." Sarah looked at Elijah with affection. "I've always told people your stories could heal hearts, Mr. Carter. Maybe they're finally starting to." Elijah laughed softly, though. It tired him. "Healing takes time, child. But it begins when people are willing to listen." Daniel carefully returned the cane to its rightful place beside Elijah's bed. He stood, feeling different somehow, lighter, yet more responsible. "I'll never look at it the same way again," he said. "And I'll never look at you the same way again either. I see now who you are, Mr. Carter. Not just a man with a cane, but a man carrying history, courage, and kindness." Elijah closed his eyes, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. "Then perhaps my father's cane has done its job once more." When Daniel left the hospital that day, he walked through Willowbrook with new eyes. The streets, the people, even the smallest details seemed filled with stories waiting to be understood. And though the cane stayed behind in Elijah's room, its meaning followed Daniel everywhere, whispering a lesson he would never forget. That night, as Elijah rested, he touched the cane one last time before sleep. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Carry it with dignity, my son, and let it guide your steps." Elijah smiled faintly, knowing the cane had begun guiding someone else too. News travels quickly in small towns, and Willowbrook was no different. By the end of the week, almost everyone had heard the story of Elijah Carter's sudden illness in the park, and how Officer Daniel Blake had been the one to help him. People whispered about how the young officer had stayed by the old man's side, about how he had visited him in the hospital, and about how Elijah had shared the story of his cane. At the bakery, customers leaned close over the smell of fresh bread, speaking in low voices. "I heard Daniel carried his cane in the hospital room," one woman said. "And I heard Mr. Carter forgave him," another replied. Imagine that. Forgiveness so freely given. Some nodded with admiration, while others raised their eyebrows. "Well, I don't know," a man muttered. "Maybe the officer's just trying to fix his reputation. Words are easy. Change is harder." The same kinds of conversations took place at the barbershop, the library, and even at the church steps after Sunday service. The town was curious, almost divided. Was Daniel truly changing, or was it just an act? Elijah, meanwhile, continued his slow recovery. He was allowed to return home after a few days, though the doctor advised him to rest. Neighbors visited often, bringing food, flowers, and prayers. Elijah sat on his porch most evenings, the cane beside him, greeting everyone with his gentle smile. He didn't speak much about the hospital or the officer. He simply said, "Time will tell us everything we need to know." But not everyone wanted to wait for time. One afternoon, Sarah stopped by Elijah's house with a notebook in her hand. She had been teaching her students about local history and felt that Elijah's story needed to be written down. "Mr. Carter," she said, settling on the porch steps, "people are talking about you and Officer Blake everywhere. They want to know what really happened. Should I write it down for the community paper?" Elijah thought for a long moment, his eyes on the cane. "Child, if you write it, don't write about my illness. Don't even write about me. Write about the cane. Tell them what it means. If they understand that, they will understand the rest." Sarah smiled softly. "Yes, sir. I'll do that." And so she did. The next week, the Willowbrook Gazette published a small article titled "The Story of a Cane." It told how Elijah's father had carved it, how it had carried memories of courage, and how it had become a symbol of strength. Nowhere in the article did Sarah mention the officer or the conflict. She simply let the story of the cane speak for itself. When townsfolk read it, something shifted in their hearts. Many who had once seen the cane as nothing more than wood now looked at it differently. Some even stopped Elijah on his walks, asking politely, "May I see the carvings?" He always nodded, letting them run their fingers over the marks that carried so much history. Meanwhile, Daniel felt the weight of the community's eyes on him. Every time he walked into a store or stood on the street corner during patrol, he noticed people watching. Some smiled as if giving him a chance. Others looked doubtful, as if waiting for him to prove he had truly changed. It was not easy for him. For years, he had believed strength meant suspicion, caution, and firm control. Now he was beginning to realize that true strength might mean patience, humility, and kindness. Still, it wasn't something he could show overnight. One evening, Daniel made a choice. He walked to Elijah's porch after his shift. The old man sat with a blanket over his knees, the cane resting at his side. Fireflies danced in the yard, their small lights blinking like stars brought down to earth. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," Daniel said, his voice uncertain. Elijah looked up with a smile. "Good evening, young man. Sit down. The night is kind." Daniel sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "People keep talking about us," he admitted. "Some think I'm changing. Some think I'm pretending. I don't know how to prove it to them." Elijah chuckled softly. "You don't need to prove it with words. Live differently, and the truth will show itself. A tree does not tell people it will bear fruit. It simply grows, and in time, everyone sees the fruit for themselves." Daniel nodded slowly, letting the wisdom sink in. "I want to grow, sir. I don't want to be the man who judged you wrongly. I want to be better, for this town, for myself." Elijah's eyes softened. "Then walk that path step by step. And remember, every person you meet carries a story, just like this cane. If you take the time to listen, you'll never see them the same way again." The words stayed with Daniel. Over the next few weeks, people began to notice small changes. He greeted shopkeepers with warmth instead of formality. He stopped to help an elderly woman carry her groceries instead of rushing past. He listened when children waved him down, with questions about his uniform instead of brushing them aside. Some townsfolk whispered again, but this time with different tones. "Maybe he's learning," they said. "Maybe Elijah's kindness has touched him." Elijah himself said nothing of it. He simply watched, day after day, from his porch. And every time he saw Daniel pass by, offering a kind word to a neighbor, or bending down to listen to a child, Elijah tapped his cane gently against the floor, as if marking each small step of growth. The community was still divided, still cautious, but something new was stirring beneath the surface. For the first time in many years, Willowbrook began to wonder if hearts, both young and old, could truly change when given patience, forgiveness, and understanding. And at the center of it all was a simple wooden cane, quietly reminding everyone that even the smallest symbols can carry the greatest lessons. The town of Willowbrook had grown restless. For weeks, whispers about Elijah Carter and Officer Daniel Blake had circled through shops, schools, and church pews. The article about the cane had softened many hearts, but the story still felt unfinished. People wanted to know if the officer would ever speak openly about what had happened on Main Street that morning. It was Sarah, the young teacher, who first suggested it. One evening, she visited Elijah's porch, her notebook tucked under her arm. Elijah sat wrapped in his blanket, his cane resting against his knee. "Mr. Carter," she began, "there's a town gathering next week at the community hall. Everyone will be there, families, business owners, even the mayor. I think it would be good if the truth came out then. People need to hear from Officer Blake. They need to hear from you too." Elijah tapped his cane gently against the wooden porch. His eyes, though tired, still carried a spark of wisdom. "If the young man is ready to speak, I will stand beside him. Not to shame him, but to remind people what forgiveness looks like." And so the decision was made. The evening of the gathering arrived, and the community hall filled quickly. Wooden chairs scraped against the floor as people settled in. Murmurs floated through the air like restless birds. The mayor stood at the front, welcoming everyone. But it was clear that the crowd waited for one thing: the moment Elijah and Daniel would take the stage. When the time came, Elijah walked slowly to the front, leaning heavily on his cane. Daniel walked beside him, his uniform neat but his face tense with nerves. The sight of the two together drew silence from the crowd. Everyone watched closely, the old man with steady dignity, and the young officer carrying the weight of his choices. Elijah reached the podium first. His voice was calm, steady, though not loud. "My friends," he began, "many of you know what happened a few weeks ago. An officer stopped me on Main Street, and for a moment I was seen not as Elijah Carter, but as a question, a suspicion. It hurt, yes, but I stand here not to add more hurt. I stand to show what healing can look like." He paused, tapping his cane softly against the wooden floor. "This cane belonged to my father. It has walked many miles through hard times and hopeful times. When you see me with it, I ask you not to see a threat, but a story of courage, patience, and the belief that love is stronger than fear." The audience listened in silence. Some bowed their heads. Others dabbed their eyes. Elijah stepped aside then, nodding for Daniel to speak. Daniel walked forward, his palms sweating. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, people he had sworn to protect. His voice trembled at first, but he forced himself to continue. "My name is Officer Daniel Blake," he said, "and I need to tell you the truth. That morning on Main Street, I stopped Mr. Carter because I judged him wrongly. I saw his cane, and instead of seeing history, I saw danger. Instead of seeing a neighbor, I saw suspicion. I was wrong." The words hung heavy in the room. Daniel's throat tightened, but he pressed on. "When Mr. Carter fell ill in the park, I was there. I saw him not as a stranger, but as a man in need. I held his cane in my hands and heard his story. That day changed me. It made me realize that my duty is not only to keep the town safe, but also to see every person with respect and compassion." He paused, his eyes finding Elijah beside him. "Mr. Carter forgave me when I did not deserve it. He showed me that strength is not in suspicion, but in understanding. Tonight I want to apologize publicly, to him and to all of you. I am sorry, and I promise to walk differently from this day forward." The room was quiet for a heartbeat, then another. And then something unexpected happened. Elijah lifted his cane and tapped it firmly against the floor. The sound echoed in the hall. "I forgive you, young man," Elijah said, his voice carrying strength. "And I hope this town will not only forgive, but also grow. We cannot change yesterday, but we can choose tomorrow." A ripple moved through the audience. Some clapped softly at first, then more joined in, until the hall filled with the sound of applause. People stood, some wiping away tears, others nodding with approval. Daniel lowered his head, humbled by the response. For the first time in weeks, he felt something heavy lift from his chest. After the gathering ended, townsfolk came forward. An elderly woman shook Daniel's hand and whispered, "Thank you for admitting your mistake." A young boy tugged at Elijah's sleeve and asked if he could touch the cane. Elijah smiled and bent down, letting the child's small fingers trace the carvings. Outside, the night air was cool and filled with the sound of crickets. Elijah and Daniel walked together slowly toward the edge of the hall. The cane tapped softly, on the pavement marking each step. "You spoke well tonight," Elijah said gently. Daniel shook his head. "I only spoke the truth. It was you who showed me the way." Elijah smiled faintly. "Then let us keep walking, young man, side by side as neighbors should." And so they did, the old man and the young officer moving together beneath the quiet stars. Behind them, the town of Willowbrook felt a little different, lighter, more hopeful, as though forgiveness had opened a door that suspicion had long kept closed. Weeks passed after the public apology, and Willowbrook began to feel different. The tension that had shadowed the town slowly lifted, replaced with a sense of understanding and unity. People no longer whispered about judgment or suspicion. Instead, they shared stories of kindness and lessons learned. Elijah Carter returned fully to his daily routine, walking carefully through the streets with his cane, tapping gently against the pavement. Children waved at him, neighbors stopped to greet him, and shopkeepers offered warm smiles. He moved with patience and dignity, teaching through his example rather than words. Daniel Blake, too, had changed. His patrols were no longer just about enforcing rules. They were about seeing people as they truly were. He smiled more freely, listened more carefully, and offered help without waiting for recognition. His fellow officers noticed the difference, and some even began to follow his example. One sunny afternoon, Elijah decided to host a small gathering in his yard. Tables were set with lemonade and cookies, and the community was invited. Children played near the fountain, while adults chatted quietly. Elijah leaned on his cane, watching the scene with gentle pride. Sarah, the young teacher, came over carrying a stack of papers. "Mr. Carter," she said with a smile, "I wrote a small book about your cane and its story. I hope it helps others see what you and your father taught you." Elijah took the papers carefully. He examined each page, tracing the words with his fingers. "This is very thoughtful, child. Thank you." He looked up at her. "May it remind people that the smallest things, like a cane, a kind word, or a helping hand, can carry the greatest lessons." Daniel walked over slowly, nodding politely at the children playing nearby. When he reached Elijah, he spoke softly. "You've shown me more than any training or book ever could." "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Elijah's eyes twinkled. "And you've shown me that even the young can grow wiser if they're willing to listen." The children ran around the yard, laughing and chasing each other. One little boy stumbled and almost fell. Without thinking, Daniel reached down and steadied him, guiding him to a safer step. Elijah watched and tapped his cane lightly. "See, child," he said to Sarah, "change is carried in actions, not just words." As the afternoon continued, neighbors shared stories of their own lessons. Some spoke of kindness shown by strangers. Others spoke of forgiveness offered to, friends. The mood was light but deep, full of understanding that had taken time to grow. Later, when the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Elijah asked everyone to gather for a small speech. He leaned on his cane, his voice steady but warm. "My friends," he began, "life teaches us in many ways, sometimes through joy, sometimes through hardship. I have carried this cane for many years, not because I am weak, but because it reminds me of who I am and where I come from. My father carved it to remind our family that even when the world seems hard, dignity, courage, and kindness can guide every step we take." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We all carry something. Memories, lessons, fears, or hopes. But it is how we use them that matters. Do we allow them to make us bitter, or do we let them guide us to goodness? This cane has carried me through life. I hope it can carry others toward understanding, too." The crowd listened in silence, some nodding, some wiping away small tears. Daniel stood beside him, silent but proud. He knew that Elijah's words were not just meant for the town, but also for him. That night, after the gathering, Elijah and Daniel walked slowly through the quiet streets. The town was calm, bathed in the soft light of street lamps. The cane tapped gently with each of Elijah's steps, a steady rhythm against the pavement. Daniel spoke softly. "I never thought a simple cane could teach me so much. It has changed the way I see the world and the way I see people." Elijah smiled faintly. "Sometimes, young man, it is the simplest things that carry the deepest lessons. A cane, a word, a gesture. They may seem small, but they can guide hearts, just as a compass guides a traveler." Daniel nodded. "I want to carry that lesson forward, not just for you, Mr. Carter, but for everyone I meet. I want to be better, not because people expect it, but because it is right." Elijah's eyes softened. "Then your steps will be lighter, even if your path is long. And perhaps in time, others will follow the example you set." The two men continued their walk in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Fireflies drifted lazily through the night air, glowing softly, and the town seemed to exhale a quiet sense of peace. As they reached Elijah's porch, the old man rested his hand on the railing, the cane firmly against his side. "Remember," he said gently, "life will always present moments of choice. We can choose fear, or we can choose understanding. We can choose bitterness, or we can choose hope. The cane reminds me every day to choose wisely." Daniel looked at him, eyes steady. "I will remember, sir. I will carry it with me in heart and in action." Elijah tapped his cane one last time that evening, a soft echo in the quiet street. Then he leaned back, smiling. The world around him seemed brighter, not because everything had changed, but because people had learned to see differently, through patience, understanding, and grace. In Willowbrook, the story of the cane spread slowly but surely. Children learned about respect and kindness, adults learned about patience and forgiveness, and Officer Daniel Blake became an example of growth and change. And the wooden cane, carved with memories and history, remained with Elijah, standing, not only as a tool for walking, but as a symbol, a quiet, steady hope for the town, and a reminder that even the smallest acts can carry the greatest power. The cane had done its work. Hearts had changed, understanding had grown, and Willowbrook was a little wiser, a little kinder, and a little more hopeful than it had ever been before. And so, the old man and his cane continued their journey, step by step, leaving a story of hope that would live long after the streets had gone quiet.